When the civil defense sirens finally fell silent on the morning of Saturday, October 23, 2077, the people of Charleston, West Virginia found themselves in a new world. Though the city itself hadn't been struck by a nuke, the power was out, outside communications were down, the roads had crumbled, gas lines were broken and erupting flame, and the populace was in absolute chaos. Many cities across the world were facing the same circumstances, and while most of them would simply collapse over the coming weeks, in Charleston, the emergency services survived. These police officers, firefighters, and medical professionals fanned out across the city, establishing order, dousing fires, assisting the wounded, and guarding the limits of the city. I'm the Irresolute Cartographer, and this is the story of the group they formed. This is the story of the original responders. When the shaking of the earth subsided and the calls for help began to rise, the state government was not in the best position to help. Governor Evans was nowhere to be found, and the lack of his executive authority was paralyzing the government response. In the absence of the governor, House Speaker Abigail Poole stepped in and began to attempt to organize the relief efforts. Though she was challenged for the leadership position by Majority Whip Tanner Holbrook, she quickly became recognized as the head of the emergency government. However, in spite of securing her new role, she found that the gap in civil authority had already been filled, and the relief efforts were generally out of her hands. The first responders had been handling the chaos on their own, and they had adapted to the lack of leadership by establishing their own chain of command. Speaker Poole could really only advise them and attempt to further their efforts with logistical support. They were going to need all the assistance they could get. Refugees were flooding into Charleston. They came for the protection of the police, the food from the emergency stores, and the medical care to treat their injuries and radiation burns. The first responders were struggling to keep up with the demand, establishing barricades to protect the city, giving out rations, and providing whatever medical care they could. As towns like Berkeley Springs ran out of supplies, the survivors there had to make their way to Charleston as well. All these survivors seeking sanctuary had the city's resources stretched to the limit. By November, the air was cooling rapidly as nuclear winter was closing in. It was at this time, with what looked to be the coldest winter on record on the horizon, and with hundreds if not thousands of extra citizens to feed and care for, that a delegation arrived from the Pleasant Valley Ski Resort in the mountains to the east. This group, headed by Harlan McClintock, requested whatever aid the city could give. With the demands of the bloated population already straining their resources, the first responders didn't have the time of day for this group of new arrivals. The delegation left, returning to their families in the mountains empty-handed. This failure to secure supplies would have dire and lasting ramifications for all of Appalachia. When the cold of winter faded, the first responders began to expand their role. They would not only serve their traditional role as emergency service providers, but take on the business of governing as well. Looking beyond the secured limits of Charleston, they saw a world in desperate need of stability, and they would be the ones to deliver it. They took on a more concise name of the Responders, and they began to venture out, connecting with other survivors as they went. In late January 2078, an expedition that included former Vaultech University PhD candidate Dasa Ben-Ami ventured north to the dangerously radioactive Morgantown. While there, they connected with what remained of the Morgantown Police Department under Chief Mayfield, and they scouted the Morgantown Airport. While exploring the grounds of the airport, Dasa spotted an older man picking flowers in the adjacent forest. She introduced herself and learned his name, Delbert Winters. Delbert, a veteran and the former reverend of the Flatwoods Church, had come to pick flowers to make tea. He listened to the responders explain their goals and he was impressed. He offered them the use of his church as an outpost, and they departed for Flatwoods together. When they arrived, they found a handful of other survivors that were making Flatwoods their home. Delbert was well primed for the mission of the responders, and he had already taken to teaching those other survivors how to safely prepare food. Dasa met with Delbert and his young ward, an orphaned boy named Colonel. She took this time to record some of the first holotapes in her Survivor Story series. While the responders departed for Charleston, by late February, they had established a small outpost at the Flatwoods Church. This small outpost would eventually grow to a sizable refugee camp for newly arrived survivors. Not all of these connections they established would be so fruitful. In March, Chief Mayfield attempted to establish a curfew in Morgantown. When the students of VTU violated that curfew, he ordered his men to fire on them. This created a predicament for the responder leadership in Charleston. They didn't want students shot, but they also knew that reprimanding Chief Mayfield might alienate the police faction within the responders. Whatever the outcome of that issue, a much more serious problem would soon rear its head. The responders hadn't forgotten the people at the resorts that they'd had to turn away the previous November, and they decided to make amends for that. While the winter weather in the valleys around Charleston and Morgantown had passed by early spring, the mountains were still covered in snow into the summer of 2076. Low on supplies for months, the resort goers had been forced to utilize horrifying means to stay alive. When the envoys for the responders arrived at Pleasant Valley Ski Resort to meet with their leader, Harlan McClintock, they were confronted by David Thorpe. The cold and privation of 7 harsh months of winter had transformed this former corporate raider with Arctos Pharma into an actual raider. He murdered the envoys in cold blood, repayment for the cold shoulder. This act simultaneously fractured the resort goers and propelled him to the top of the largest faction that would emerge. The responders had gone into the mountains to make amends, and instead they found themselves at war with the newly born Raiders of the Savage Divide. In the face of the new raiding parties that were coming out of the mountains, the responders would spend the year focusing on consolidating their holdings. They'd been conducting radio broadcasts since the war, but they now established a new broadcast operation in Flatwoods. The signals from these broadcasts drew new recruits to their cause, including Kesha McDermott. Kesha, once a high school science teacher, had been in Watauga orchestrating a statewide science fair before the bombs. She managed to escape the robotic revolt orchestrated by Scott Turner on October 22nd, only to watch the mushroom clouds rise the following day. She hunkered down with some of her students through the winter. When the snow thawed, they followed the responder broadcasts over the mountains of the Savage Divide. They were robbed when they traveled, but they managed to arrive in responders' territory safely nonetheless. Just as Delbert spent his time teaching survivors how to cook, Kesha spent her time teaching them how to properly purify water. When she wasn't teaching, she would monitor the local environment. In the summer of 2079, about a year after the disastrous encounter at Pleasant Valley, news of new survivor groups began to filter back from over the mountains. Scouts for the Charleston Emergency Government had spotted a paramilitary organization in control of the Thunder Mountain power plant, and that members of the separatist prepper group known as the Free States had left their bunkers. The next spring, the responders dispatched Derek J. Castle over the Savage Divide to investigate the situation in Harper's Ferry. At the end of April 2080, Derek arrived in town where he found the Free States working to restore order, building walls around the city, purifying the air, and restarting the town's clinic. Though the city was still a bit chaotic, the work was beginning to bear fruit. When Derek left for Charleston, he promised to return with supplies and to help out at the clinic. When he returned, he brought with him a senior responder, the organization's future leader, Maria Chavez. Maria Chavez was sickly as a child, and she grew up in poverty. Her mother, a nurse at AVR Medical in Charleston, couldn't afford the medicine that Maria needed, so she had become adept at herbal medicine. She passed her knowledge on to her daughter, so when the war came home and the supplies ran out, Maria was ready to provide and experiment with herbal remedies. Maria met Free Stater Ella Ames in Harper's Ferry, and the two became, if not friends, colleagues in the struggle to rebuild society and solve the medical issues created by the bombs. Together they would study the unfortunate creatures known as ghouls in an effort to understand how they functioned and determine what it is that had made them the way they were. Along with the scientific cooperation between the two organizations, a new trade route was established between Harper's Ferry and Charleston. By 2081, the responders would make contact with a new faction of survivors, the Brotherhood of Steel. Scouts for the former Majority Whip Tanner Holbrook had spotted these people at the Thunder Mountain power plant all the way back in the summer of 2079. But not knowing who they were or where their allegiances lay, the Scouts chose to observe them from a safe distance. At that time, they weren't the Brotherhood of Steel. They were Taggarty's Thunder, an Army Ranger group under the command of Lieutenant Elizabeth Taggarty. In the time since shortly after the bombs, they'd been in contact with Lieutenant Taggarty's old friend, Captain Roger Maxson on the West Coast. Sometime in 2081, Captain Maxson introduced Lieutenant Taggarty to a new concept of his, the Brotherhood of Steel. This new organization of knights and scribes, headed by a paladin, would protect people and safeguard the technology of the old world. Thus, Taggarty's Thunder became the Appalachian branch of the Brotherhood of Steel, and Lieutenant Taggarty became Paladin Taggarty. The responders provided supplies to the Brotherhood, and they cooperated on security operations when in proximity to one another. In Charleston, Tanner Holbrook, who was always an admirer of anything military-related, was a strong proponent of the Brotherhood of Steel. He did what he could to divert supplies to Paladin Taggarty's organization. While Speaker Poole agreed to provide supplies to the Brotherhood, she rebuffed Holbrook when he requested that the responders carry the supplies over to the Brotherhood. She explained to him bluntly that the responders were not his delivery service. They were far too busy battling a new type of mutant that had emerged near Huntersville. First spotted in 2082, the responders would spend the next 4 years off and on fighting these mutants, the super mutants of Huntersville, but we'll come back to this fight later. Back on the other side of the mountains, Charleston was becoming more orderly all this time. While the city had faced its share of attacks by the raiders of the Savage Divide, the responders had created an orderly existence for its citizens. The police force was in operation, raiding illegal drug manufacturers, mediating civil disputes, and arresting and trying criminals in the court system. Things were going so well in 2082 that for the first time in half a decade, the city was preparing to celebrate Christmas. The responders hung lights and were preparing to distribute an extra ration of food when the raiders struck late on Christmas Eve. The raid was a bad affair on both sides, with 31 responder casualties, including 7 dead, and 8 raider casualties. The fate of Charleston was sealed in the ambiguity of the term casualty. The responders knew that these 8 raider casualties were in fact 7 dead, 1 wounded, while the raiders believed that it was a solid 8 deaths. The individual at the heart of this disputed figure was Rosalind Jeffries, girlfriend of the now solidly entrenched raider boss David Thorpe. While her companions believed that she had been killed, the responders had saved her life. They patched her up and interrogated her, learning her status within the raider community. They were drawing up plans to use her as a bargaining chip when the false news of her death reached David Thorpe. Heartbroken and enraged, David Thorpe took a mini-nuke stolen from the Brotherhood of Steel and raced for the Summersville Lake Dam. Simultaneously, a party of responders departed Charleston to bargain with him. In the early morning hours of Christmas Day 2082, he carried out his premature revenge. In a matter of moments, a wall of water and debris burst into Charleston. In a matter of minutes, his girlfriend, alongside hundreds of civilians and responders, was dead, drowned beneath the floodwaters. The leaders of the Charleston emergency government were gone, flushed away like many other hundreds. The survivors of the attack regrouped on the north side of town with those that hadn't been in the city at the time. Cognizant of the danger of their situation, they fled north to Morgantown. The former student population had been replaced by feral ghouls in the years since their first visit. They avoided the city center and instead chose the airport to serve as their new headquarters. As the responder remnants settled into their new home, the raiders were combing the ruins of Charleston. They held mock trials for those they found alive, executing them as a warning to any who might oppose them going forward. With their task complete, the raiders returned to the mountains in victory. The fall of Charleston was a massive blow to the responders, shattering the society that they had built in the 5 years since the bombs. While in large part resettling in Morgantown was synonymous with restarting the responders, some of the old leadership had survived, including Maria Chavez and Melody Larkin. While the loss of so many in Charleston and the fear of the raiders might have been dreadful, Maria and Melody knew that they couldn't just hide in Morgantown. The only viable way forward was to venture far and wide across the lands west of the Savage Divide, recruiting all those that they could. To that end, Maria and Melody developed the concept for a new force within the responders, an elite unit that could delve into the dangerous environment of the ash heap, where they'd been loath to explore because of the potentially toxic atmosphere. They wanted to give this force an allure, so they named it the Fire Breathers, the name given to Larkin's grandfather and his sons, in reference to the high-proof moonshine they brewed. As this force would necessarily be heading into the most dangerous parts of Appalachia, they were provided with better gear, food, and ammunition than any other responder unit. They needed a proper headquarters and training ground, and they found it at the Charleston Fire Department. This location made sense for a couple of reasons. Strategically, Melody and Maria wanted to make contact, if possible, with the survivors in Beckley, Bromwell, and Welch, cities within the ash heap. The Charleston Fire Station is well situated for that purpose, lying on the border between Charleston and the ash heap. Along with this specific goal, the outpost would also restore responder operating capacity in the Charleston area. Symbolically, retaking the station surely would serve as a message to the raiders that they wouldn't be wiped out so easily. Melody was able to set this organization up, in part thanks to her eminently effective lieutenant, Hank Madigan. Once a member of Taggarty's Thunder and then the nascent Appalachian Brotherhood of Steel, Hank Madigan defected to the responders because of his desire to help people above all else. As the second in command of the Fire Breathers, he would become an invaluable asset in the field, both leading Fire Breather forces and working alone to track down useful technology. In one of his solo expeditions, he tracked down excavator power armor at the Garahan mining headquarters. With their competent leadership in place, the Fire Breathers would soon make expeditions into the ash heap, and while they wouldn't find much there in the way of survivors, Their hazardous environment capabilities allowed the responders to establish outposts in the train stations of Lewisburg and Welch. Back at Morgantown Airport, there was far more work to do than could be managed by just Maria Chavez. New leaders rose from the ranks of the responder survivors. Among them, Jeff Nakamura and Sanjay Kumar. In the hours before the Christmas flood, Jeff Nakamura had been part of the team that was meant to negotiate with David Thorpe. His party was an hour outside of Charleston when they heard the blast. They returned to find the city in ruins. While his lucky survival in the face of so much death would always haunt him, in that moment, he joined his brethren in the march to Morgantown. Once there, he ended up the responders' quartermaster, overseeing the logistical operations of the entire organization. Sanjay Kumar became the responders' chief engineer. He took on a major role in the rebuilding of their operations through repairs and automation. He established a series of safe houses in Morgantown. He restored the food processing machines of Mama Dolce's and inspected the sorry state of the Tigert water treatment plant. The responders had lost hundreds in Charleston, and there were roles that they just didn't have the personnel for. To compensate for this, Sanjay opened a robotics workshop at Morgantown Airport, repairing and reprogramming robots to take on roles wherever they were needed. He was likely involved in the work to create an automated early warning system known as Forest Watch that was meant to warn the responders of potential threats. Along with this, robots were put in place at train stations across responders' territory, working as vendors. To the north, other robots would play a role in the responders' next expansion efforts aimed at the city of Grafton. By the 2080s, the land north of Morgantown was practically uninhabitable. The countryside was covered with a toxic white powder while the rivers glowed orange. Practically all plant and animal life was dead or mutated. Strangely enough, these problems were only marginally linked to the war. Rather, they could be blamed on a pair of issues: a crashed space station and the old Grafton steel mill. A few months before the bombs, the steel mill was sabotaged by a disgruntled former employee. This sabotage turned the mill's gaseous pollution into solid matter that rained down like poison snow. Had the mill been shut down, cleaned, and repaired before reopening, the problem might have ended there. But the owner of the mill refused, viewing the dust as punishment for the workers for their sabotage of the plant. Shortly after the bombs, a United States Space Agency space station crashed down, spilling radioactive, fluorescent liquid into the water supply. Without anyone to clean these problems up, they only got worse. When the responders eyed the valley, it's honestly hard to say what potential they saw in the region, but nevertheless they did. In an effort to clean up the land, they dispatched a series of poison control robots that spontaneously exploded upon entering the valley. They weren't deterred though, and soon a campaign was underway to take the city of Grafton from the local population of ghouls and mutated creatures. They were joined in this effort by their new neighbors at Grafton Dam, the Brotherhood of Steel. The Brotherhood had only recently taken the dam, giving themselves their first outpost west of the Savage Divide. Together, the responders and the Brotherhood rolled in and took control. The responders established new outposts at Grafton Station and within Grafton itself soon after. Although they'd have to deal with the annoyance of the self-elected robotic mayor of Grafton, this marked the new high point for the relationship between the responders and the Brotherhood of Steel. When the capital fell on Christmas Day 2082, the responders had to abandon some of their operations. This included the offensive against the super mutants initiated earlier that year. By 2086, the unopposed super mutants were becoming a far more serious threat, sending attacks against cross-mountain trade routes and even driving the Gourmands Raider gang out of the mountains. Thanks to their newfound cooperation with the Brotherhood, the responders could finally re-engage their forces against the super mutants. In the closing days of May 2086, a united force composed of the responders and the Brotherhood coordinated a new offensive to remove the threat from Huntersville. While there were numerous casualties, the coalition won, ending the super mutant threat for years to come. This victory would serve as the apex of early post-war civilization in Appalachia. Unfortunately, circumstances inside and outside Appalachia were about to shift dramatically. The first shift came with the sudden and unexpected destruction of Harper's Ferry. Not long after the responders and the Brotherhood finished off the super mutant threat in Huntersville, enormous bats appeared in the skies over Harper's Ferry. These bats dropped clouds of plague over the city and assaulted the defenders physically. Those afflicted by the clouds of plague and those bitten by the bats soon transformed. Their flesh turned red as though it had been scalded, and green crystals burst forth. When the physical change was complete, they turned on their neighbors and joined the bats in their attack. Facing imminent death or transformation, the Free Staters and the citizens of Harper's Ferry broke off their defense and fled. The giant bats that had arrived from the south eventually returned to their nests, but the city was still filled with the transformed citizens that served them. The responders didn't witness this attack firsthand, but when they heard the news, they dispatched Derek Castle to investigate. Derek arrived in the region and began to interview the survivors. He heard the tales of the bats, the transformation, the death, but he was unmoved. Derek believed that whatever it was that had happened at Harper's Ferry, the Free Staters were likely just being their old selfish selves, retreating to their bunkers at the first sign of trouble. Sadly, this opinion likely colored the responders' view of the threat posed by the bats in the years to come, and they didn't take them anywhere near seriously enough for far too long. As for the change in circumstances outside Appalachia, in the Lost Hills bunker, the mission of the Brotherhood of Steel was being refocused. While they had so far maintained the twin goals of helping people and preserving technology, the latter would now supplant the first. In Roger Maxon's view, the preservation of technology would be the legacy of the Brotherhood of Steel. They would help people, but only if it furthered their agenda of preserving technology. With this shift, the Brotherhood and the responders lost the main focus of their cooperation. Grafton Dam was soon abandoned, with the Knights returning to the eastern side of the Savage Divide. Without the trading center and Harper's Ferry, cross-mountain trade dwindled. While at this time, the giant bats for the most part continued to fly the skies around their nests in the region known as the Cranberry Bog, a few were seen venturing out over Appalachia. The survivor communities of the responders, the Free States, and the Brotherhood turned inward, focusing on their own communities rather than uniting to face this new threat together. In the aftermath of the societal schism, the responders returned to their concentration on recruiting new members and building a society for the survivors of the war. One of the new recruits that joined around this time was a hermit by the name of Miguel Caldera. Before the war, Miguel had worked as a programmer for the United States Space Agency and later for Vault-Tec. When the bombs came down, he retreated from civilization and camped alone in the woods. In order to stay safe in this far more dangerous world, he used his technical expertise to reprogram a Protectron to serve as a sentinel while he slept. While this Protectron could alert him to threats creeping in the night, he knew it couldn't protect him from the giant bat he'd recently seen go flying by. Miguel saw the responders not only as an opportunity to help others, but as protection against those bats. He began his time with the responders at Morgantown Airport, where he reprogrammed robots and computer systems. Having always loved the outdoors, Miguel made sure that he would also be able to teach outdoor survival skills as well. Things at Morgantown Airport had changed dramatically from when the responders arrived as refugees. They'd set up their headquarters in the terminal, with a command center, dormitories, a lounge, storage rooms, jail cells, and a marketplace. Outside, the tarmac was littered with campers, tents, and storage container dwellings. They had their robotics workshops, the infirmary, crop fields, a cemetery, and a partial ring of defensive barriers. The responders had school for the kids in the community, and even built a dance floor on the tarmac to use in various celebrations. After Miguel came to the airport, he worked in the robotics workshop for a time, but he would soon be given a major new task. The responders needed a better training program for new members, and they selected Flatwoods to serve as the entry point for those new volunteers. To this end, Dasa Ben-Ami was reassigned to serve as the head of the Flatwoods outpost, and Miguel Caldera followed in order to set up the automated training program. The automated course was needed both due to the limited manpower available, but also because of an incident in nearby Sutton, in which a responder named Casey accidentally killed two people he was attempting to help. The details of this event aren't laid out, but it made clear that the responders' volunteers needed proper training if they were going to help people. Flatwoods was doing fairly well at this time. Delbert Winters was teaching cooking classes and guiding grief counseling services, as Kesha McDermott monitored the local environment to watch for changes. When Dasa and Miguel arrived, Miguel worked with Kesha and Delbert to establish an automated onboarding system for responder volunteers, including food and water safety courses. Along with this, Miguel worked with Delbert to convert old vending machines into food dispensers. Dasa used her new position as a means to continue her Survivor Stories series of holotape interviews, a record she was making of the lives of the survivors of the war. When he wasn't in Flatwoods, Miguel would return to Morgantown Airport, where he would work on rebuilding and reprogramming robots and computer systems for the responders. While there, he met a responder courier named Gary Wilkins. The two of them fell in love, and they would see each other whenever they were in the same town. While their relationship was blossoming, the relationship between the responders and the Brotherhood of Steel was souring. The Brotherhood had always relied upon donations of food, ammunition, and medication from outsiders, and in the early days the responders had been happy to help them. Practically speaking, it had been a good investment for the responders. A simple donation of supplies provided them with power-armored allies with heavy weapons to assist in their struggle to secure Appalachia. When the Brotherhood's mission changed to preserving technology above all else, the calculation changed. Now the responders were providing the Brotherhood with supplies so that they could sit in their secret base on the other side of the mountains, securing more and more technology for themselves. Then the demands from the Brotherhood began to increase. More and more supplies were being requested. The Brotherhood claimed they were in the Cranberry Bog fighting the bat creatures that had destroyed Harper's Ferry. These creatures, named Scorched Beasts by the Free States and referred to as Sierra Bravos by the Brotherhood of Steel, were still generally unknown west of the mountains of the Savage Divide. One or two had been seen on rare occasions flying high above the forest, but generally speaking they were mere curiosities. There were those among the responders who believed that the threat was real. Responders like Rachel Price, a medic who left her colleagues behind to join the Brotherhood. But for most of the responders, this talk of the Scorched Beasts posing a major threat seemed overblown. The insistence of these increased requests for supplies was making them feel more and more like demands. Eventually, the Brotherhood found the responders to be practically hostile to them. To my knowledge, they never came to a violent exchange, but the Brotherhood was less and less welcome every time they visited Morgantown. While the Brotherhood continued to demand supplies to fight the Scorched Beasts, the responders were having their own problems. To the north of Morgantown, the transformed servants of the Scorched Beasts, known as the Scorched, were making their way over the mountains. As their number increased, the responders were beginning to be forced back. Not only could the Scorched survive in hostile environments like the Toxic Valley, but they utilized guns like raiders, and they carried the deadly Scorched Plague that had transformed them in the first place. If the defending responders got too close to the Scorched, they could become infected themselves. When the fighting reached Grafton in early 2094, the responders were pushed back yet again. With their northernmost outpost lost, the Scorched began to push into the forests on the north. At the Vault-Tec Agricultural Research Center in Flatwoods, a responder named McFadden was struggling to restart the experimental farms. He had been worried about the declining food stocks and he was hoping to help feed the defenders. As the threat of the Scorched worsened, McFadden decided to reactivate the project prematurely. He was killed by the Mr. Farmhands and converted into fertilizer. Luckily, the responders in Flatwoods were able to shut this down, if only temporarily. While most of the responders' efforts against the Scorched were focused on direct combat, there was one scientist working out how to track the Scorched. Well, technically speaking, there were multiple scientists working on how to track the Scorched, but Amy L. Carey was the scientist working with the responders to track the Scorched, while the others were working on building the Scorched detection system with the Free States. We'll come across that project again later in this video, but it's covered in more detail in my video specifically on the Free States. Anyway, when I say Amy Carey was working with the responders, I mean to say that she wasn't a responder, but she was cooperating with them. Amy Carey didn't want to be a responder. She didn't want to join any group. But she respected what the responders did. So when she started working on a way to detect the Scorched by their contamination of the environment, she was happy to share her research with them. She and her boyfriend Jeff Nakamura, the responders' quartermaster, would visit each other often. Jeff loved Amy to the point that he was going to propose marriage, but she turned him down preemptively. She explained to him that too many people were relying upon the work they did to distract themselves with marriage. Amy's competence was such that she was a constant target of recruitment efforts either from Jeff or from other responder higher-ups like Maria Chavez. While constantly having to deal with this unwanted attention flustered her, a much more tangible problem would soon rear its head. In early 2095, as the Brotherhood arrived in Morgantown requesting more supplies, they heard a rumor about the Scorched detecting research. For the new head of the local Brotherhood contingent, Senior Knight Wilson, this research held immense promise. The responders refused to tell him where Amy Carey was, so Senior Knight Wilson dispatched his people to find her and recruit her, or at the very least obtain her research. If you're interested in why Senior Knight Wilson was now the head of the Appalachian Brotherhood of Steel, and what happened to Paladin Integrity, I suggest you check out my video on the Appalachian Brotherhood of Steel. For the purpose of this story, it suffices to say that the Brotherhood had attempted a last-ditch mission to stem the flow of the Scorched Beasts, and by the spring of 2095, it was becoming clear that this mission had failed. Senior Knight Wilson was flailing, attempting to grab onto any lifeline he could. Amy Carey had no intention of being recruited or having her research taken from her, so she relocated to the Tigert Water Treatment Plant. While there, she saw and heard signs of the Brotherhood closing in, so she attempted to make a run for it. She had hoped to rendezvous with Jeff Nakamura at the Cowspots Creamery, but sadly this site would serve as her final resting place, as she was likely felled by the local ghoul population. Soon, the Brotherhood was too tied up fighting on their side of the Savage Divide to hunt for her. In August of 2095, a radio signal was heard from the eastern side of the mountains. It was the last words of the Brotherhood, a simple statement that, quote, "Defiance has fallen," unquote. The relationship between the responders and the Brotherhood had grown so frayed by the latter's demand for supplies that the responders didn't exactly know what this meant. Though she had resented their demands, Maria Chavez didn't want anything to have happened to the Brotherhood. She dispatched a mission to the Free State's bunker of Abigail Singh. Chavez wanted her envoy to determine the meaning of the broadcast and if the Brotherhood was okay. Unfortunately for all of Appalachia, Defiance was a reference to Fort Defiance, the Brotherhood's headquarters in Appalachia, and indeed, Defiance had fallen. For years, the Brotherhood really had been fighting an all-out battle to keep the majority of the Scorched Beasts bottled up in the Cranberry Bog through the use of lures, missile turrets, and heavy firepower. Without the Brotherhood standing in their way, the Scorched Beasts were now following their servants over the mountains in greater and greater numbers. Amazingly, despite the fact that the responders were fighting a losing battle against the Scorched in the Toxic Valley, they had yet to focus on the threat they posed. As late as spring 2095, their hazardous environment troops, the Fire Breathers, were still engaged fighting unrelated threats in the ash heap. It seems that it took the complete destruction of the Brotherhood to put the threat of the Scorched in context. It was at this point that they really began to take action to weather the storm coming over the Savage Divide. This included refocusing the Fire Breathers on the Scorched, consolidating the responder forces in Morgantown, and researching the Scorched Plague to find a cure. The Fire Breathers began to battle the Scorched above all other threats. Without the Brotherhood guarding the eastern end of the Big Bend train tunnel, it was becoming a highway for the Scorched to enter the region. The Fire Breathers would attempt to serve as a bulwark against their passage for as long as they could. Along with this, Fire Breather's second-in-command, Hank Madigan, began to search for technology to aid them in their battle against the Scorched. He led an expedition into the headquarters of Atomic Mining Services in the heart of Watoga, returning with knowledge that formed the foundation for anti-Scorched weaponry. To consolidate the responders, Maria Chavez began to call them back to Morgantown Airport to join in the defense. This included Dasa Ben-Ami and many of her subordinates in Flatwoods. This required Dasa to leave Flatwoods in the hands of Delbert Winters, Kesha McDermott, and Colonel. While the responders could use all the help they could get, they still had obligations to support the refugees in town, especially in Colonel's case, as he was protecting and caring for several orphan children. To research the Scorched Plague and accommodate those in the early stages of infection, the responders established a quarantine at Morgantown Airport. This consisted of a fenced-off area that held a containment building, a laboratory, and a burn pile for the corpses of the dead. They guarded this site with 2 volunteers who were themselves confined to the quarantine zone. Overseeing the Scorched research at the site was Dr. Claire Hudson. After studying the Scorched for a time, she came to believe that she might be able to create an inoculation to prevent the spread of the Scorched Plague. Unfortunately, her laboratory in the old hangar at Morgantown Airport didn't have the necessary equipment, so she relocated to the basement laboratory of AVR Medical in Charleston. She arrived there on July 6, 2096, and she began her work in earnest. Along with these more direct routes to facing the Scorched, Maria Chavez also dispatched scouts to watch the door of Vault 76, hoping in vain that the door would open and her force would be augmented by the dwellers within. Unfortunately, July 2096 would mark not the start of the turnaround in the war against the Scorched, but the beginning of the end for the responders. On July 24, 2096, Delbert Winters was murdered in his home in Flatwoods. For years, Delbert had been trying to help the survivors of the war, teaching them to cook, and helping them through the loss they felt. He met his fate in the hands of just one of those survivors. Sophie Yates, a young woman who had arrived just 6 months prior, wanted to leave and go join the raiders in the Savage Divide. Delbert, who had counseled many survivors in the hopes of keeping them from making that very choice, attempted to talk her out of it. The emotionally disturbed Sophie stabbed Delbert, went home, recorded a mocking survivor story, and committed suicide. This murder-suicide occurred practically simultaneously with the death of Gary Wilkins at the hands of the Scorched at Morgantown Airport. Miguel Caldera was broken by Gary's death. He buried him on the hill and returned to the woods from whence he came, meeting his own fate soon after. Things didn't improve as the summer turned to fall. At AVR Medical, the process of creating the inoculation was slow. Dr. Hudson's work was plagued with delays, from the Scorched invading her laboratory to the material shortages caused by the responders' logistical network breaking down. To make matters worse, there were rumors of a massive horde of the Scorched just on the other side of the Big Bend train tunnel. She knew that the Fire Breathers were preparing to assault and collapse Big Bend Tunnel, and that they would need the inoculation if they were going to have any chance of coming out alive. At that moment, it wasn't just the inoculation that the Fire Breathers were waiting for, but Hank Madigan. In October 2096, Madigan was on another mission over the Savage Divide, searching for any advantage against the Scorched. While exploring the mire, he came across a recently constructed piece of equipment of no known origin. He attempted to inspect it, only to find himself surrounded by a heavily armed band of Free Staters. They captured him and brought him inside one of their bunkers to interrogate him. They explained that what they had built was a Scorch Beast trap, technology created from both their own research and tech they had salvaged from the Brotherhood of Steel. Along with this, they revealed the network of Scorched detection sensors that they had deployed across the mire. Unfortunately, this network wasn't functional as they'd reached a bottleneck in their plans. They had to connect the sensors of the SDS using an uplink that had to be placed at the highest point in the region, the top of the old Raider headquarters at Pleasant Valley Ski Resort. Madigan volunteered to carry out this crucial task, and he departed with the uplink on his back. Unfortunately, though the ski resort had been hit by attacks, it was still in Raider hands. They captured Madigan, broke the uplink he was carrying, and imprisoned him in the structure called the Top of the World. For the fire breathers, the absence of Hank Madigan was incredibly demoralizing. They knew how dangerous their mission in Big Bend Tunnel would be. The prospect for success with Madigan in command had been low. Without him, it looked downright suicidal. But the situation was such that the fire breathers couldn't wait any longer. Without her second in command, Melody Larkin knew she would have to lead the attack. The day the assault arrived without the Scorched Plague inoculation and without Madigan. They rallied at the Rusty Pick, and they pressed on to the tunnel. It was a disaster. The fire breathers not only failed to complete their mission, they were slaughtered in the process. The tunnel was still intact, and now there wasn't anyone remaining to stem the flow of the infected. The horde of the Scorched flowed through the tunnel and flooded into the forest. By November, the Scorched beasts were blotting out the sky at Morgantown Airport. Maria Chavez watched the building siege, confident in the belief that the beasts were simply waiting until their Scorched minions arrived and reached a critical mass before beginning the assault. The responders did what they could to reinforce the barriers, but there was nowhere near enough material to make them strong enough for what was coming. Maria broadcast a final distress call to anyone who might hear her, but there were few that remained in Appalachia by this point. Knowing how to finish the inoculation, but unable to obtain the supplies to do so, Dr. Claire Hudson recorded instructions on how to complete her work and proceeded towards Morgantown Airport. She believed that if she was going to die, she should be with her friends. Even if they had been inclined to help, the Raiders of the Savage Divide had dwindled to David Thorpe and a few remaining loyalists. On the other side of the mountains, the Free States were in no position to help. Sometime early in the second week of November 2096, the siege of Morgantown Airport ended in an assault. The exterior of the airport was overwhelmed almost immediately, leaving only the terminal in the hands of the responders. They had a battle plan that called for holding strong points for as long as possible before retreating to the next strong point. The battle appears to have played out in this manner, but it wasn't long before each successive strong point fell to the overwhelming assault. Eventually, all that remained was the control room. Maria Chavez fought until the end, finally slumping, mortally wounded against the map table. Their conquest complete, the Scorched Beasts broke off the assault and returned to their nests. Inside the airport, 6 responders remained alive, 3 that barricaded themselves in the lounge, 2 hidden in a basement room, and another in a storage closet. The 3 in the lounge, Jansen, Caleb Widmer, and Tanner, decided that with the Scorched beating down the door, that they'd rather go out on their own terms than risk becoming Scorched. The 2 in the basement split up, with one making a run for it, while the other stayed behind. Likely both were quickly overwhelmed when they were discovered by the Scorched. The individual in the storage closet realized that she had actually locked herself in, and there was no hope of escape. After surviving for a few days, she took her own life to avoid death by dehydration or starvation. The Scorched began to disperse, moving out into the surrounding countryside. Strangely enough, a new responder arrived at Morgantown Airport a few days later. Colin McLeader, a newly minted responder volunteer, arrived on November 20th, 2096 to find the carnage left behind by the battle. Having originally arrived in Flatwoods on July 25th, 2096, the day after Delbert Winters was murdered, he had joined the responders via the automated system. When he completed his volunteer courses and discovered the distress calls from Morgantown Airport, he departed from Morgantown with another survivor, Dr. Adam Vinn. On November 20th, they searched the terminal looking for responders and found nothing but death. He logged a question in the system, asking if anyone else was still accessing the network, but received no response. In Flatwoods, the last of the responders in Flatwoods would meet their fate sometime in late October to early November 2096. While Delbert had perished back in July at the hands of Sophie Yates, Kesha McDermott and Colonel remained on hand to watch over the remaining refugees and monitor the environment. In these closing days, one of the town's residents, Jeremiah Ward, lost his granddaughter Mia. While the responders consoled him over the loss, claiming dogs had taken her, he didn't believe them. He'd seen strangers in the hills scoping out the town. He believed that these strangers had taken her, and he was dead set on getting her back. To that end, he prepared his last will and testament, naming Mia as his sole heir. He packed a bag, and he was cooking one last meal when the town was hit by a raider attack. The tiny number of defenders quickly met their fate. Colonel was killed guarding his charges. Kesha McDermott was slain as she took water samples. The raiders captured the proprietor of the Flatwoods Tavern and locked him in one of the fridges, leaving him to suffocate. They then devoured whatever resources remained in the town. On November 5th, 2096, Dasa Ben Ami, having apparently escaped the fighting at Morgantown Airport, returned to Flatwoods, where she perished from her wounds. If there were any responders left in Appalachia, they likely didn't survive the turn from 2096 to 2097. For 5 years, that was the story of the responders. But that all changed on October 22nd, 2102. The night before the general opening of Vault 76, the overseer of Vault 76 became the first new responder volunteer since Cullen McLeader. She did this in order to track down any potential survivors, and the system was locked to all but responders members. She registered and she performed the training required to join. She was quickly followed in this effort by many of the other residents of Vault 76 who were following her trail. That trail led to Morgantown Airport, where the Vault dwellers witnessed what remained of the responders' last stand. They then followed on to AVR Medical in Charleston, where, with the help of Dr. Claire Hudson's notes, they completed the Scorched Plague inoculation. From there, the dwellers joined the ranks of the fire breathers by passing the physical, knowledge, and final combat exams. It wasn't long after this that the former residents of Vault 76 managed to blunt the Scorched Beast threat, allowing Wastelanders to return to Appalachia. 2 newcomers in this time would add themselves to the ranks of the responders. In 2103, Heather Ellis and her dog Chloe became new residents of Flatwoods. Heather followed the responders' radio broadcast to town, intrigued by what she heard. She found the town abandoned, but she so respected the responders that she donned one of their uniforms and she walks the streets of Flatwoods awaiting their rebirth. Along with Heather, a new would-be fire breather arrived at the Charleston Fire Department, Tiffany Brantley. Tiffany passed the physical exam, but she's been tripped up by the knowledge exam for the time being. Along with the 2 new members of the responders, a relative of one of those slain at Morgantown Airport arrived in 2103 as well. Dontrell Haynes, a former Army medic, came to Morgantown Airport to search for his brother Marcus. He found the remains of the battle, and he chose to honor the dead. He cleaned up the control room and laid the dead to rest. While the area is still dangerous due to the persistent presence of the Scorched, Dontrell doesn't want to leave. Terminally ill with cancer, he wants to be close to where his brother died when he passes. That just about does it for the overall story of the first iteration of the responders, but I have some notes and some information that didn't quite fit into the overall narrative here. I'll start this section by saying there are a half dozen responders for whom we know the name and rank, but we don't know anything else about them, and they play no role in the overall story. I'll list them alphabetically. Jerry P. Abernathy, Supply Train Guard. Veronica D. Chang, Rapid Response Team, Field Medic. Chelsea R. McKee, Forest Watch, Mechanic. Lillian Tompkins, Provisioner. Kevin J. Trajor, Rapid Response Team, Field Medic. And Ryan T. Zelnak, Chems Expert. Along with this, we know of Lucas de Blasson, a responder at Morgantown Airport who was upset that someone had placed a pie in a safe rather than in food storage. That's his entire known story, so I figured he fits this section pretty well. Second, there's a list of another dozen names of responders that we know even less about. Fields, A. Huso, Jackson, J. Lake, T. Lambert, M. Martinez, McCoy, Q. Moore, S. Powers, M. Sparkman, R. Tate, and S. Whitaker. These are the known names of the responders of Point Pleasant. When Fallout 76 launched in 2018, it was clear that there was a fairly significant presence of the responders in Point Pleasant. It appeared that they had operated a clinic in the local church and established walls to protect the citizenry. There were just a couple of notes related to their presence, detailing plans to scavenge for materials and their guard rotations. I published a lore video on Point Pleasant back in September 2019, in which I stated that I hoped that we'd learn more about these responders in the future. This is still my hope now. I didn't include them in the larger narrative because not only are they not referenced by any other responders unit, there is, if anything, less of them to see now than there was when the game launched. The Mothman Equinox event has obliterated much of what there was to see of the former responder presence. Along with this, the lore that does exist is not easily understood due to a lack of context. The scavenging note in particular raises all kinds of questions, because it details plans to search locations far closer to other responders' outposts like Arctos Pharma and Vault-Tec University. This leads to questions like, was this the real last stand for the responders? There's no telling. This part of Fallout 76's lore has been bugging me for 3 years now, and I still don't have answers. Now for some of the select stories of responders we know more information about, but that didn't fit well into the overall narrative. Before the Scorched threat arose, or at least before it received the attention it deserved, the fire breathers were engaged in combat with other potential threats to the responders. One such threat was the mole miners of the ash heap, and we can see at least one example of that in the fire breathers engaging the mole miners in the events that took place in March 2095 at Brim Quarry. When a fire breather scout witnessed a group of hostile individuals at this site on the outskirts of responder territory, a squad was dispatched to deal with the threat. 5 fire breathers, Yaz, Garrett, Dustin, Omar, and their commander, Lieutenant Thomas, arrived at the quarry and began their assault on the lower level at about 7:15 p.m. on March 10, 2095. While they successfully cleared the mole miners from this section, their newest recruit, 20-year-old Garrett, was slain in combat. They buried him and made camp for the night. The following day, they charged the hill, attempting to kill off the remaining mole miners. Unfortunately, this second battle went badly for the fire breathers, resulting in the death of every member of the squad. There are 2 interesting things to note here. First, those of you that have played Fallout 76 know that mole miners aren't the toughest foes. So an entire squad of the best trained and equipped force within the responders being taken down by mole miners is odd. It seems that the lore of mole miners doesn't quite match the gameplay. A second interesting thing to note here is that Lieutenant Thomas doesn't seem to have encountered mole miners before this fight. From the way he describes them in his action report, I think that we can take from this piece of lore that the mole miners didn't emerge until nearly 2 decades after the war. It's also possible that Lieutenant Thomas and his squad just had never encountered them before, but that doesn't hold much water for me, as I have to think that the fire breathers in general would have been well aware of the mole miners from the amount of time they spent in the ash heap if they were above ground. He seems to be completely unaware of them. One final note in that story, Lieutenant Thomas was one of the original responders, having been a lieutenant in the Charleston Fire Department before the war. Moving on from Brim Quarry, I have the story of a squad of fire breather candidates that met their demise while still in training. This group of 5 friends, calling themselves the Scorched Slayers, attempted to join the fire breathers through the automated training program. Composed of Maxine Ballard, Andrew Rhodes, Sylvester Tate, Rita Wilcox, and Timothy Wolfe, the squad completed the first 2 legs of the fire breather training in Charleston and at the Charleston Fire Station before traveling into the ash heap for the final exam. The site of this exam was an old Garahan mining complex known as the Belching Betty. While Garahan had abandoned the mine due to a fire that burned within, it served as the perfect environment to test fire breather recruits on their hazardous environment skills. The 5 of them began the test, donned their hazardous environment gear, and descended into the mine, confident in their abilities. The goal was simple: go deep into the mine and activate the emergency beacon. Things quickly went awry. Shortly after entering the mine, both Timothy Wolfe and Andrew Rhodes were slain by the Scorched. As Sylvester demanded they abandon the test, Rita revealed to Maxine, the squad leader, that Sylvester was the cause of the death of their friends. Against his protests of innocence, she claimed that he broke formation, allowing a swarm of the Scorched to overwhelm the others. Sylvester claimed that she was lying and again demanded they leave. Maxine wasn't going to flee though, and Rita was on her side. They told Sylvester that if he fled, he would likely be killed by the Scorched, but he turned tail and fled anyway. Together, Maxine and Rita pushed on as Sylvester was indeed laid low not far away. Though Maxine and Rita managed to reach the emergency beacon and activate it, it brought down an army of the Scorched upon them. They died quickly. There are a couple of interesting things to consider here. First, there's another responder to mention here, or at least responder-adjacent person, Buck. Buck was Rita's boyfriend or husband. We know this because of a holotape that he created for her at the Alpine River cabins. While he didn't understand her desire to become a fire breather, he did respect her choice to do so. Second, this event raises a couple of questions. First, when did it happen? And second, were the Scorched intended to be so numerous in the test? Due to the fact that they're taking the part in a completely automated test without any humans checking in on them, I think the fire breathers were either occupied fighting the Scorched or potentially even dead. It could be that the Scorched Slayers entered the Belching Betty in the period between the fall of the fire breathers and the fall of the responders. As for the question of were the Scorched intended to be so numerous in the test, I'd say no. I could be wrong about this, but I don't imagine that Melody intended to lose so many in this test. So I have to assume that either she was unaware that so many were present, or she was already dead. When we as former dwellers of Vault 76 performed the exam, we're given a pistol made specifically to kill the Scorched, so we know that they were intended to be part of the exam. One last thing to mention, it could be coincidence, but one of the Scorched Slayers was named Sylvester Tate, and one of the scavengers for the Point Pleasant responders is listed as R. Tate. It could be a coincidence, or they could have been related. Now the story of the quarantine guards at Morgantown Airport, Wyatt Johnson and Olivia P. Henderson, To refresh your memory on the matter, the responders had a quarantine at Morgantown Airport that they used to contain those infected with the scorched plague so that they could study them. The quarantine was guarded by 2 volunteers who were themselves quarantined as a precaution. Due to this confinement requirement and the nature of the work involved in the quarantine zone, the responders made sure that their psychologist, Dr. Madison, monitored their mental states. She kept digital records of these interviews that we can peruse. The basics of what I take away from these interviews is that Wyatt Johnson chose to volunteer as a form of self-punishment. He blames himself for not having prevented his mother's death to the scorched. On the other hand, Olivia P. Henderson went into the war with a terminal cancer diagnosis and a short life expectancy. Having survived for nearly 2 decades past her expiration date, she developed a different perspective on life and decided to spend the time she had helping others like Wyatt. There's still one responder in Flatwoods I haven't said a word about yet: Scott Shepard. Scott was a nurse before the bombs, and he helped the responders provide medical care in the aftermath. He was also a conspiracy theorist who believed that his dog attacked an alien in the bushes outside his house 235 hours before the bombs. I was about to start this section with a joke about how he probably could have used Dr. Madison's help, but let's face it, there are alien abductions in the Fallout universe, and the Enclave is more insidious than most conspiracy theorists could have conceived. Scott may have been paranoid, but at the same time, is it paranoia when they really are out to get you? The last responder to discuss went by the name Deandre. We don't know much more about Deandre, but we do know that he was part of the early expeditions to Harper's Ferry because a local named Lydia fell hard for him. The 2 of them carried out a relationship for some time. Along with this, Lydia got Free Stater Abigail Singh to let them spend some time together in her bunker. The last thing I want to mention in this section is that the responders had a trading post at Camden Park. In fact, there's ample evidence for both the responders and raiders holding territory here. But the fact that the responders bot is still functional points to the responders either kicking the raiders out or arriving after for whatever reason they abandoned the site. Now that we've covered the individuals and locations that were part of the responders but not part of the main narrative, I've got some notes on the content that was mentioned in the narrative. First, I want to explain my process in constructing the narrative here. To put this story together, I rely upon, to the greatest extent possible, lore that is explicitly within the game. Sources for this include notes, holotapes, terminal entries, digital records, signs, and physical evidence like the locations of dead bodies. Unfortunately, these items can, at times, get you only so far, and I have to link the lore items with some educated guesses. Rather than detail every time I did this, I'll give you an in-depth explanation of one of the places that I had to construct the lore. This lore construct is the trip that the responders took to Morgantown and then on to Flatwoods in January or early February 2078. There is no explicit item stating that this trip took place, or that Das Ben-Ami was involved. I constructed this story from 6 pieces of lore. Item A. In Das Ben-Ami's survivor story, she explains that she went to VTU before the bombs and returned to Charleston, where she joined up with the responders once they formed. Item B. In the holotape entitled Volunteer Training Program Food, we get the story of the first time that Delbert and Dasa met, when he was in the woods near Morgantown Airport, picking flowers when she met him. Item C. In Delbert Winters' survivor story, he relates that he lent his church to the responders to use as an outpost. Item D. Delbert's terminal holds an entry entitled February 20th, in which he relates that the responders have set up a camp in town. Unfortunately, he doesn't give a year, but the previous entry of January 15th relates his confusion about surviving the bombs, when he thought that it was the biblically prophesied apocalypse, which makes me think this is 2078. Item E. In Colonel's first survivor story, he says that he's 13. He talks about cutting holes in gym shorts. I talked about this in my video on Flatwoods, but in my personal life, gym shorts weren't a thing until middle school. Going off this and other context clues, including how fresh the loss of his father is in the holotape, I think that this was recorded in early 2078, meaning Dasa would had to have been in Flatwoods around that time. Item F. Abigail Poole's terminal in Charleston has an email from Melody Larkin on March 29, 2078, talking about Chief Mayfield in Morgantown firing on students breaking curfew. From these items, I constructed the narrative that the responders were attempting to connect with other emergency services in early 2078. Thus, they organized an expedition to Morgantown. They chose to send VTU PhD candidate Dasa Ben-Ami along to serve as a guide to a city she knew well. While there, they connected with Chief Mayfield, and Dasa met Delbert. Delbert's natural inclination to the responders' mission led him to lend his church in Flatwoods to them. They went to his hometown, where Dasa recorded the survivor story with Colonel. There are some issues with some of these lore items. I already explained my thinking here and there, but Dasa's survivor story has some real issues in terms of ambiguity. She claims to have joined the responders early, relocated to Morgantown, and then Flatwoods with them. Along with this, she claims to have been with them for a couple of years. This doesn't really fit the timeline established elsewhere, in that the responders formed early after the bombs, late 2077 to 2078, and the flood and relocation of Morgantown occurred in 2082. These events are 4 years apart, and they have to have occurred before her eventual move to Flatwoods. I've chosen to assume that the couple of years comment is not really two, but a non-specific way of saying she's been with the responders for a while. Along with this, she later says, quote, "Been with them for, I guess, 2 years," unquote. This is not ambiguous in length. She's considering her statement. I think instead of the responders, this is a comment saying she's been with the people of Flatwoods for 2 years. Anyway, I hope this has given you some insight into my thought process. If you think there are other things here that I haven't explained well enough, let me know in the comments and I'll get back to you. Second, we know almost nothing about Chief Mayfield. While in the narrative I had him as the chief of the Morgantown Police Department, we don't actually know that this was the case. There is one canonical piece of lore connected to him, and it's in an email from Melody Larkin to Abigail Poole, telling her about the shooting in Morgantown. There are at least 3 pieces of cut content related to Chief Mayfield, or Chief Mayweather as he was known at some point earlier in development, and 2 of those do point to him being the chief of the Morgantown PD, but as I said, those are pieces of cut content. His ordered shooting isn't even mentioned in Alicia Parker's History of Morgantown. There are 2 potential general backgrounds for his character with the information we do have. Either he was the Morgantown police chief, or he was the police chief of another community, and he brought some police in with him to attempt to re-establish order in Morgantown. I chose to use the non-canonical lore as a guide to his origin, and placed him as the Morgantown police chief when the responders arrived in 2078. Third, the destruction of Charleston probably led the responders to widen their focus to more of Appalachia. While they had ventured out to Morgantown and Flatwoods early on, supporting the hundreds in Charleston demanded an enormous share of their effort. After the loss of so many in Charleston and with the relocation to Morgantown, they expanded their reach from Lewisburg and Welch in the south to Grafton in the north. Beyond this, the destruction of so much of the existing hierarchy of the responders is probably potentially responsible for the rise in prominence of Jeff Nakamura and Sanjay Kumar. I don't know what positions they held before the flood, as there's no evidence of what those roles were. The only clue that we do have is that Jeff was part of the group meant to negotiate with David Thorpe. This doesn't necessarily mean anything. It could be that he was the quartermaster already. But what if he was just a guard or the diplomatic envoy? It's not clear. One thing about Jeff and Sanjay we don't know is if they're dead or alive. While I'm leaning towards them being dead, as it's likely they fell in the assault on Morgantown Airport, it's always possible that they fled. Fourth, something I mentioned already in my Brotherhood of Steel lore video, we have cut content to consider as the answer to why Madigan left the Brotherhood to help found the Fire Breathers. There's a cut conversation in which Hank Madigan explains that he was happy to join Taggarty's Thunder to help people, but Maxon's Brotherhood is too interested in preserving technology and not enough in saving lives. Again, this is cut content, so not canonical, but it makes sense to me as to why he would desert. One last thing to mention on that note, this non-canonical conversation also details that Hank Madigan was a Marine at some point in the past, and that would explain his proficiency in combat. Fifth, and also something I mentioned before, in this case in my video on Flatwoods, there's some weird stuff that happened around Cullen McLeader, the last new responder before the opening of Vault 76. When Cullen arrived in Flatwoods, Dasa Ben-Ami was gone to Morgantown, and Delbert had just been murdered the previous day, but Kesha McDermott was still around. Kesha last signed into the responder system on October 25th, 2096. Cullen was trying to figure out where the responders had gone. Why didn't she tell him anything about Morgantown? Along with this, why did it take Cullen over 2.5 months to go from Flatwoods to Morgantown? He and Dr. Adam Vinn left from Morgantown on September 1st, 2096. They didn't arrive until November 20th, 2096. Why did it take so long? I don't have satisfactory answers for either of these questions, but it does lead us to the next point. Sixth, Delbert and Dasa first met when he was picking flowers near the airport to make tea back in Flatwoods. This feels like a day trip type activity, not a 5-month plus round trip. In the real world, Flatwoods and Morgantown are about 70 miles apart. In game, they're a short walk apart, but the game world is obviously truncated. All of this does lead to the question of how far apart are they in the Fallout universe. Seventh, while the responders were unaware of the presence of the Enclave, we get a small window into the view of the responders by the Enclave. This view comes from the recording of a conversation between an Enclave Major and Secretary Eckhart. The Major reveals that they view the responders as a potential reservoir of recruits, but that these recruits are unlikely to join willingly. Strangely, Secretary Eckhart does not endorse bringing the responders on board with reprogramming, saying, quote, "We're not going to be able to torture our way back to supremacy," unquote. I say strangely as this feels really out of character for him. The man who was willing to loose Liberator bots, super mutants, and scorch beasts on the populace to further his cause wasn't willing to reprogram civilians to serve as operatives. 8th, the imprisonment of Hank Madigan at the top of the world actually postdates the destruction of the fire breathers within Big Bend Tunnel. We know this because he managed to call the Charleston Fire Department from the outskirts of the Pleasant Valley Ski Resort, and his message was not received. He was absent on that mission when the fire breathers went into the tunnel, but he wasn't actually imprisoned yet. 9th, the responders appear to have had air support resources. I didn't mention this in the narrative section as there was no mention of it in the narrative. Instead, we know of these resources because of the responders marked Vertibird crashed into the roof of the airport. Along with this, we know that the airport was serviced by the automated emergency government supply drop system. So long as the end of the runway was clear, the drops would arrive from some unknown origin. Lastly, I said at the start of this video that this is the story of the original responders. I say that for the same reason that this is part 1 of the story of the responders. As many of you probably know, as of August 2022, the responders are set to be a renewed force within Appalachia in the near future. When the time comes, I'll produce a video covering this new iteration of the responders as well. Anyway, that should do it for the story of the responders. If you want to receive notifications when I launch these lore videos, you can follow me on Twitter at Gaming with Maps. I've been streaming on YouTube lately. I'm currently streaming Saturday afternoons when I have the time, so if you're interested, come and check it out. If you appreciate what I do here and you want to support the channel financially, you can become a patron with Patreon. I want to thank my patrons Mesothelioma, 76 of Texas, Jill AWS, Dark Malcontent of Metaverse Studios, Brian, and Real76 for their support. This has been the Irresolute Cartographer. Thanks for watching. I'll see you again next time.